Hello everybody. The world of classic cars is an often fickle and frustrating one, and that's to those who understand it. But there is just one thing you really need to know, and that is that more often than not, a car's value is dictated by what it represents more than what it actually is. By which I mean, for something to have a high price attached to it, it doesn't actually need to be a good car. Case in point, the DeLorean. The reason one of those is the same price as a Ferrari F355 is not because it's a better car or as good as, but because it's rare, it was in Back to the Future, and you know you still want one even when you know that it's not a very good car. However, there are also cars out there that have earned their reputation and their price tag. And perhaps the best of all classics are those that are held in high regard both by investors and also drivers. And one of the very few that may lay claim to being a car such as that is this, the 993 generation Porsche 911, the last of the air-cooleds. A car that the day it rolled out of the factory now 30 years ago had impossibly high expectations placed at its feet, because everybody knew this was the last of the line and therefore destined to be a classic. But today, with the model now commanding prices in excess of when it was new, is it really worth it? Well, for the first time in years, I'm back behind the wheel of a regular 993 Carrera, and I intend to find out. I want to say a big thank you to this car's owner Gregor, who has lent it to me for the entire day, and this is rather nice. It's a bit of a treat. I picked it up this morning from central Edinburgh. Well, I say central Edinburgh, what I mean is sort of outside central Edinburgh, because unfortunately it is another city that has adopted the concept of ULEZ, but unlike down in England, they're doing it properly up here, and if this car were driven in the middle of town, it'd get a £60 fine. Yeah, then the next day, £120, so on and so forth. You get the idea. But this video is not about that. This video is about this car. And I've been driving it now for about 4 hours. And in this time, I've managed to get a really good feel for what this car is all about and how it behaves in all manner of different situations. So this, more than my regular reviews, is going to be a somewhat living with type appraisal, as much as a how big a smile does it put on your face when you're down a nice fun bit of road video. So then, to recap, what is the 993 all about? And this section, I'm sure, will be particularly handy for those who don't speak 911. This, as already mentioned, was the final generation of the air-cooled 911, which debuted back in 1963. It debuted in 1993, which I've always believed is the reason for the code name. It followed on from the 964, which I think took its name from the M64 engine, a version of which you'll also find in the back of this, and it went into production at the very start of 1994, then being discontinued just 3 years later, in 1997, when it was replaced by the genuinely all-new 996, the first water-cooled 911 and a new dawn for the firm. Today, it may be difficult to imagine this, but back in the 90s, Porsche was in a very, very precarious position. Sure, as ever, it had its fans, but its model lineup consisted entirely of rather old cars. The 911, the 928, and the 968, which itself was the third version of a platform that had been introduced in the 1970s, as first the 924, then the 944. And the 928 was no different, really. Evolving, yes, but not radically changing in its 2 decades of production. And so Porsche knew things had to change, and they had to change in a big way. But at the beginning of the 90s, they simply didn't have the money for this to happen. Plans, though, were in motion for this big shake-up, which eventually manifested first as the Boxster, launched in 1996. but to tide customers over until then, Porsche set about reviving and revising their model lineup and doing the best that they could. Then for their flagship, the 911, the 964 turned into this, the 993. Just like the 968, Porsche claimed this car was 80% new. A bold claim then, and a very bold claim now, but one that is ultimately irrelevant. I think a lot of parts numbers were changed. However, there were also some genuine differences to be seen. First off, the exterior styling, which first appeared on the 968 and was carried over here. The front end was significantly revised, those classic 911 haunches still present, but now moulded slightly more neatly into the bodywork. It is today a very 1990s thing to behold, but still a very pretty thing to behold. It has that classic 911 side profile, and you're never ever going to mistake it for anything else. Under the skin, there were also some big differences. Though the engine was effectively carried over from the 964 and has the same designation, M964, it made a little bit more power. Here, 272 PS, and later, with the VarioRam variable intake system, 285 PS. This is joined by a modest amount of torque, 240 to 250 pounds-feet, but these engines were never really all about the numbers. Instead, they were about character. Or certainly, that's what people like to say, particularly as they became a little older and a little harder to excuse their lack of numbers. By the time this was in production, an M3 of the day would have been making effectively the same power. And that is to say nothing for the Honda NSX or the Ferrari F355, which, yes, did command quite a bit more money, but Porsche needed 2 turbos to match what it could make from an engine that was actually 100cc smaller. That has a 3.5-litre V8, and to this, a 3.6-litre flat 6, the classic boxer engine. Like the 964, it features twin-spark ignition and proper dry sump lubrication, unlike the later cars, which have what Porsche call quasi-dry sump, which I think is code for wet sump. Anyway, out the back of this, you'll find no fewer than 4 oil pumps. And that is one of the reasons I think they struggle to make money on these cars. Inside, it is then very familiar to just about anybody that's been in a 964 or indeed any older 911, which is to say, it's charming if you want to be nice about it, or an ergonomic nightmare if you don't. The driving position is fundamentally quite good. You do sit rather upright, but you do have excellent visibility courtesy of the paper-thin A pillars, the C pillar and B pillars being way back there, and the whole thing feels very natural and easy to place. You've got that classic view out the front with those lovely 911 haunches, and it is just a wonderful car, this. Driving it around town is no issue whatsoever. The clutch, though heavy and a little odd because all the pedals are floor hinged, like a Beetle, does take a little getting used to, but just 20 seconds behind the wheel of this, and I felt very much at home. Now, there's a good reason for that, and that's because way back before I'd started YouTube, I convinced my mother to buy a pair of 911s. And this is back in the day when that wasn't a particularly extravagant thing to do. And one of those was a 993, a Targa in polar silver, which I think might be the shade that this is in. Now that we paid £15,000 for. Did a lot of work to it too, nearly £10,000 worth, and we were lucky to get, I think, about £21,000 back for it when we sold it. But I put a lot of miles on that car and really enjoyed it. And today, I'm very grateful I did get to enjoy such a car at a very young age, and when they weren't worth anywhere near as much as they are now. Now, Mum was able to get her car really cheap because back in the day, they didn't command the same money that they do now. And that is a bit of a problem because though with prices higher, many of them are a little bit better, not all of them are. And there are quite a few out there that have got a hidden past. And so, if you are going to check the classifieds for a new 911 or just about anything else, don't forget to use CarVertical, the super-powered super search that will cross-reference a number of databases from around the globe, telling you all the information you want to know on any potential used car purchase. It takes just 60 seconds, you need only a registration plate or a VIN number, and for 20% off the service, don't forget to use my discount code JAYEMM. As far as I'm aware, this car is entirely standard, although one part of it I'm not sure about is the exhaust. Gregor said he thought that maybe it was aftermarket, but it doesn't look it. It's not particularly vocal when it goes past, no more or less than any other number of 911s I've heard which are standard, although it is quite boomy, particularly on the motorway. And you're reminded as soon as you get back into this of all its many fun little quirks, like the twin wipers basically on top of one another here. They do sort of work though. The turning circle, that's not exactly fantastic. And the pedal box, which, yes, I've already mentioned is weird because it's floor hinged, but it's also impossibly tight. I've put my driving shoes on today, and that was very necessary. Last week I drove a Lotus Elise and did the same thing, and it wasn't. Yeah. There is also no adjustment whatsoever in this steering wheel, so if you are particularly chunky of thigh or long of leg, it might be an issue. There are also switches just about anywhere and everywhere that they can put them, so the entire HVAC panel is essentially obscured by the wheel and the stalk. The light controls are also frankly baffling to anybody that hasn't spent a good amount of time getting used to these cars, and the little bevy of switches down here seems to change between every single one that I drive, even though I'm sure that's not true, but it feels like it is. In its defense though, I will say, these seats are very comfortable. They are the regular comfort ones, not the hardback sport seats that today command a ludicrous premium on eBay, and it's also got quite a bit more room in the back than I remembered. Although unfortunately I think that's probably not as helpful as it may first seem, because it's still going to be quite tight in there. There's definitely no ISOFIX, and so I think this is a car where it's been sort of legislated out of usefulness in that regard, because today to get a modern child seat in there, I think you might struggle. But on that front I'll defer to my friend Ben at Dad Cars. He is the expert for all things cars and children. Me though, I talk about the driving bit. And that, let's be honest, is the area where the 911 has really forged its legend. No, it's never been the fastest thing, 0 to 60 or top speed. This will achieve just over 170 mile an hour, and the 0 to 60 is 5 seconds, 5.5, something like that. But it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. What does is the feel, the experience. Now, frustratingly, I've spent the entire morning with glorious, lovely sunshine, and I appear to have timed the filming bit of my review exactly in line with this. And that's annoying, because I've really enjoyed having a lot of fun in this car, and it may well be that I turn around and head for some other roads, because I can tell you, when you are in the mood, it is absolutely sensational. In fact, it doesn't have that much power, but it does have plenty of grip, thanks to reasonably wide 255 section here rears, they're 17s, and a lot of weight over that back axle too. In fact, when you lift the lid on the back of this car, not only can you see an engine, which in a modern 911 you can't, you can also see that it is genuinely over the rear axle. Today, a 911 is only a good fart away from being a mid-engined car. And you can feel that in the dynamics. And by that I mean, yes, the modern car is far better if you want to measure it, but if you want to feel it, oh, this is special. Here we go. Now this is one of those cars where if you want to just bimble along, cruise, change up at 3,500 RPM, you can, and it will be amazing. You'll enjoy that panoramic view out. You'll enjoy the sound the car makes even at idle. But then, if you want to have fun, you put your foot down, you can do that. At 4,500 RPM, this thing really comes alive. It's got torque below that, and it feels like an engine that's very, very difficult to catch truly off guard, such is the nature of low-stress, large-capacity lumps. But if you want to get the best from it, you have to rev it and work this also new Ford 993 6-speed gearbox. It does feel like the lever is just a little bit too far down, but it's a medium length throw, but with great accuracy. And I've got to say, this entire car does feel very, very taut. It feels like a well cared for example. Gregor, I must say, did make it out to sound like it was in a far worse condition than it actually is. Truthfully, the only thing I really don't like, the Fuchs alloys, but that's just me, and they do come off. Now, one curio of this car, and this might actually be different to all of the other 993s I've driven, is that this is an early model. It is a 1994, so from the first year of production. And the first couple of years production had this earlier engine, which does without the Vari-O-Ram system. That is one of the reasons it's quite a peaky thing. But it also has a much shorter ratio gearbox. And so, though the later cars do have a little more power and torque, and we're only discussing a few percent here, it's actually slightly slower. However, it is not actually entirely accurate to say that the gearbox and engine changed at the same time. And I know this because when I found out about this change and my mother had her Targa, I checked the manual, in which you'll see not just the code for the engine, in that one a Vari-O-Ram, which came out the same year as the Targa, but also the gearbox. And I saw that hers had the code for the short ratio gearbox, G21, as opposed to G20. And so that meant we had the sweet spot, the more powerful engine with the shorter ratio gearbox. Though I never worked out whether that was simply a bonus of it being built exactly at the right moment, when they got the new engines but still had the old gearboxes, or whether that was something they did specifically for the Targa to try and offset the extra weight of it. And for the 993 generation, the Targa is also a model worth giving special mention to, because that is where they debuted their new roof system. Previously, the 911 Targa had been a classic Targa with a pop-out panel that I've never really liked. More recently, the 991 and 992 have mimicked the look of the old Targas. However, for 993, 6 and 7, the Targa instead adopted a massive sliding glass roof, which I actually quite like. And there are a lot of people who really dislike the Targa more than any other, because it doesn't give you the wind in the hair of a cabrio, but has compromised the dynamics of a coupe. I, though, prefer to think of it as a happier compromise. You don't get the weird fabric top look and the strange profile of a cabrio, but you do still get the open air experience as and when you want it. Fact is, though, most people are just terrified of the roof going wrong, because they did, and when they did, they were generally very expensive. On that note, I should also say maybe that old 911s aren't quite as easy to maintain as people sometimes make out. They can and will break, and I would actually wager that a well-maintained Ferrari of the period isn't necessarily any more or less reliable. However, the big difference is that if your Porsche does break, there are far more specialists and main dealers for them, so you've got plenty of choice of who to take it to. You can get the parts, and they will be a lot cheaper than the equivalent Ferrari items. So if you do want to use your car regularly, and you don't want it to go away for months at a time, these are very sensible buys. Although even this one has aircon, which currently isn't working, cruise control, which doesn't work, though that is bothering me far less, and I'm pretty sure the oil gauge may also not be working. And in fact, because this car is oil and not water cooled, there are 3 dials relating to it here. One on the right is for pressure, which is currently set sky high at 5 bar. The one next to it is for temperature, and that is just where it should be, about a third of the way up. And then over to the side by fuel is oil level. Now that one gets people in trouble, because that only works when the engine is warm, running, the car is on level ground and stationary. The rest of the time it should be down, as it is currently. However, when I stopped earlier and checked it, it didn't move. So when I get the car back to Gregor, I'm going to recommend that he does maybe consider putting a little bit of oil in it. Other things I have noticed which relate more to this specific car, there is a very frustrating rattle slash buzz slash squeak over there, which I think could be one of the air vents. This also has the fancy Porsche classic communication system, which has always looked like a great thing. It's a way of giving your car more modern functionality. Bluetooth, nav, all that sort of stuff, but with a style that will kind of blend in. And it's actually a bit useless, because though the functionality of it is fine, you can't see it. I don't know who designed this, but I think they did so in a dark room in the back of Stuttgart, never having to actually try their own product in a car. In just about every single scenario I've driven this car today, barring the dark forest we're about to go through, that has been virtually invisible. That's a very un-Porsche thing, that. Most disappointing. But more humorously, this car also had a new steering wheel fitted a while back, and for whatever reason, it has the most sensitive horn I have ever known in a car, kindly demonstrated by my ever-willing driver, George. However, in good news, the rain has now passed through and not really done all that much. The ground appears to be nice and dry, and so I'm going to turn this around, put my foot down again, and talk to you about dynamics. In other words, what makes a 911 a 911. Compared to most modern cars, particularly Italian ones, the steering here is actually what you might call a little slow, but it is full of feel. And absolutely worth noting about the 993 is that with this car, Porsche were continuing to work on the 911's fearsome reputation, that of snap oversteer. And to cure this, potentially once and for all, they introduced something called the Weissach axle, which had first seen service in the 928. It is a revision of their rear axle setup, which introduces specific geometry to the car at moments when it may be useful. In other words, it keeps the rear end a little more stable, giving you masses of confidence to push on. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in this car, I feel far more at home, far more confident to press on through a corner than I would in, say, a Ferrari 355. That is also a car with a reputation for being somewhat snappy, as nearly all mid-engine cars are. However, with the 355, Ferrari got the steering wrong, and it doesn't talk to you in the way that this really does. Sure, that is on paper a quicker car, though also beaten by the 911 Turbo, but today things in the classic world have gone all sort of murky and weird. And making this video, I am reminded of a phrase that a friend quoted to me this morning, a chap called Tom from Project 40 Cars. And if you would like to help a new YouTuber out, hop over to his channel and give him a subscribe. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. But what he said to me is that comparison is the thief of joy. And he's absolutely right. It really, really is. You see, the 911, the 993 specifically, and now the 964, it has a problem, which is that, yeah, sure, 10, 15 years ago, you could pick one of these up for 20 grand, or in really good nick, 30 grand, and a turbo then was about 50. But today, if you want a regular, common or garden variety 993 Carrera 2 coupe, manual, nothing fancy, you're talking about 55 to 70,000 pounds. And the problem is that today, that money would get you into a Ferrari 360, it got me into a 550, you could possibly get into an NSX, though you would now struggle, you'd get into an RX-7, there's all sorts of other really cool stuff, including cars that when new cost an awful lot more. A 993 Turbo is now 150 grand plus. And yeah, it's a great car, but for that money, you go, oh, blimey. I mean, for what this car is probably worth, say mid-50s, I bought an Aston Martin DBS, a car with a V12 in it, that was a Bond car, that was made in far, far smaller quantities than this, and even accounting for all of the V8 Astons, they're still probably as rare as these. They made something like 68,000 993s during the car's production run. Tell you what though, it drives old school, but the speed, it's still enough. In fact, it's just right But yeah, though I would go and buy a DBS, a 360, an F430, something like that instead, if those don't float your boat, and if what you want is a 911, this is a brilliant car, full stop. And I think it's probably also one where it's fair to say, yes, they were cheaper 10 years ago, but they were undervalued. And so what has happened here, I think, is not just the market going doolally for them, and the Porsche market really does seem to exist almost in its own bubble compared to other cars, but I think it is people beginning to appreciate that they are really, really good things. And right here, right now, I'm very jealous of Auto Alex, I can tell you that. He's got a 200,000 mile 993 in arena red, which is my favourite 993 colour, though I'd prefer it on a turbo, but let me take nothing away from the man. It's a gorgeous car. But that is the lunacy that the 911 market has found itself in. You need a 200,000 mile example to be able to get one for 50 grand now. That's a bit mad. But the car is good. Drives nicely, reasonably practical. Boot is a slightly odd shape and size, granted. Around town, it's also a little firmer than you might expect it to be, but once you pile on the speed, the suspension really does start to work. Not adaptive or anything like that. Porsche didn't do that until a fair bit later. However, when you get into a car like this, a car which has a legend around it, there are things you expect from it. And I spoke about dynamics earlier, that steering, that 911 feel, that light, delicate front end. This does have power steering. You wouldn't really believe it though, because it's still fairly weighty. But it gives you confidence, and it also feels so well put together. You can tell that men with moustaches constructed this car. No facial hair, you didn't work at Stuttgart in the 90s. Them's were the rules. And for some people, that'll be enough to put you off the car. For others, that'll send you headed straight to Auto Trader. And if you don't mind, I think that's where I'm going to go. So, I want to say a big thank you to Gregor for bringing the car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.